Hello everyone. Today our task is to look at that great reforming figure, John Calvin. Why, look, John Calvin is with us. He's here to be sure that I don't make any mistakes. But I tell him, I said, hey Johnny, there's no such thing as a mistake. Everything that happens is the will of God, right? That's what he says in this quotation above. The plain and indubitable conclusion will be that the will of God is the one principle and all high cause of all things in heaven and earth. All right, so as we look at the character, the life and ministry of John Calvin, we need to realize that he has stirred a number of reactions to who he was and what he said. And we have those that adore him and those who abhor him. Listen to what Louis Spitz has to say. He's a Lutheran historian. Calvin was one of those strong and consistent men of history who people either liked or disliked, adored or abhorred. Another historian, the French Ernst Renan, said of Calvin, he was the most Christian man of his age. C.H. Spurgeon, the Prince of Preachers himself, said of Calvin, the longer I live, the clearer does it appear that John Calvin's system is the nearest to perfection. And William Cunningham, a Scottish theologian, said Calvin is the man who, next to St. Paul, has done most good for mankind. High praise indeed. One more historian, Philip Schaff, taking into account all his failings, Calvin must be reckoned as one of the greatest and best men of God whom God has raised up in the history of Christianity. These historians have looked at the record and came up with high praise. Listen to what Theodore Beza, who was Calvin's associate and successor, he had this to say: I have been a witness of him for 16 years, and I think that I am fully entitled to say that in this man Calvin there was exhibited to all an example of the life and death of the Christian, such as it will be not easy to depreciate, and it will be difficult to imitate. Difficult to imitate, yes, but many will find it easy to depreciate Calvin's reputation. For example, Roland Bainton, who is the great biographer of Martin Luther and Michael Servetus, which should give you a hint about his attitude toward Calvin. Bainton said, if Calvin ever wrote anything in favor of religious liberty, it was a typographical error. Okay, so not much on Calvin's view of religious liberty. Erich Fromm, the author, said that Calvin belonged to the ranks of the greatest haters in history. My. One of Calvin's enemies in Geneva said, better with Beza in hell than with Calvin in heaven. This fellow has a misunderstanding about heaven and hell, I think. Will Durant is another historian with a different view of Calvin, but we shall always find it hard to love the man Calvin who darkened the human soul with the most absurd and blasphemous conception of God in all the long and honored history of nonsense. That was from Will Durant, who has little respect for things religious anyway. But here's the most shocking. This person says Calvin has, I believe, caused untold millions of souls to be damned. And this from Jimmy Swaggart, who has a few damned souls to his credit as well. All right, so I deliver all of this just to tell you what you already know, that Calvin is a person with a strong reputation, and that he is both adored and abhorred, just as Lewis Spitz had to say. All right, well, let's find out why. Let's look at the life and ministry and teachings of John Calvin. He is the subject of our lecture today. All right, first we need to talk about the background to the French Reformation. We've looked at the Reformation in Germany and Switzerland. Finally, it comes to France through the influence of the Renaissance and Humanism and the University of Paris. Often, university students are the people who carry Reformation and other new ideas into their setting. The leading humanists in the emerging French Reformation were a man named Lefebvre and his student Guillaume Brissonnet, who became the Bishop of Meaux. Brissonnet appointed Lefebvre and another reform-minded individual named Guillaume Farel as preachers and teachers in his diocese. So the Bishop of Meaux, Brissonnet, had opportunities to elevate reformers in his sphere of influence. And the laity themselves began to pressure for more reforms, and they began to seek to remove icons from the walls of the churches. Now, the Pope, of course, urged the repression of the Reformation. And so Clement VII forced Brissonnet to dismiss Farel and the other reforming preachers. However, the reform movement continued to spread in Paris and in cities like Lyon and Noyon. Now, Clement VII had a strong influence over the French king, Francis I. Charles V, actually Charles I of Spain, had been at war with France, had captured Francis and put him in a Spanish prison. But Pope Clement influenced Charles to release Francis, and so Francis felt an obligation to the Pope. And so, under the Pope's influence, Francis suppressed the Reformation in his country. His sister Marguerite, however, favored these reforms and continued to support financially and through refuge and other ways. She supported the reform movement. Now, on October 17th, 1534, there were placards. Think of these as posters that appeared in several cities. They were all denouncing the Roman Catholic Mass. All right, so just like Zwingli, they were calling for a simple evangelical observation of the Lord's Supper. And these placards were printed in Neuchâtel, where Farel and other reformers had preached. So Neuchâtel seems to be a place that is fomenting these calls for Reformation. Francis began to persecute the Protestants. They were known as Huguenots, and 200 arrests were made in just the next month, and within 3 months there were 20 executions. So Francis and the Catholics were very serious about persecuting and even executing these Protestants, determined to maintain Catholic power and control in France. And so, Enter Jean Calvin. We call him John Calvin. He was born at Noyon. He was the son of a lawyer, and his father was in the service of the bishop. And so his father saw the advantages of a career in the church. And so John's father took his son and had him tonsured at age 12. I think we've talked before about the tonsure. The tonsure was to have one's crown of one's head shaved, and this was a sign of service to the Lord, whether a priest or a monk. Anyone in clergy had a tonsure cut out of the hair of one's head. We're not sure what is the source of the practice of the tonsure. It is said that in Roman times, a slave would have the crown of his head shaved as a sign of servitude. And so this readily carried over into the clergy to show that priests and monks were servants to God. You'll notice I have a tonsure, okay, but it is not of my own doing. It is a natural tonsure, but certainly I'm glad to show service to my Lord and my God, Jesus Christ. All right, but for a 12-year-old boy to have his crown tonsured and to be prepared for ecclesiastical career is quite young. But notice that he received benefices from a church he did not pastor. And so this is an interesting practice of the Catholic Church, that he enrolled, was tonsured, became a priest, and received benefices. And of course, these benefices were income that helped him to pay for his education at the universities of Paris and Orleans. So, well educated. Now, let's get Calvin in a chronological context, because he's definitely a second generation reformer. All right, in 1521, Calvin was tonsured at age 12. That same year, Luther took his brave and courageous stand at the Diet of Worms. So Luther was facing death at the time Calvin was being tonsured in the Catholic Church. 2 years later, Zwingli's Reformation was established in Zurich. So the Reformations in Germany and Switzerland are well apace, while Calvin is still a teenager playing at clergy in the Catholic Church. In 1526, Calvin completed his Master of Arts in Philosophy, but the year before, Anabaptists began performing believers' baptism, and the year after, the first Anabaptist martyrs were executed for their faith in the gospel and believers' baptism, and the Schleitheim Confession was published. So we see that the Reformation is moving along in other areas, and John Calvin is simply coming along, but soon he will join the efforts to reform the church. In 1533, Calvin had a friend named Nicholas Cope, and he was elected rector of the University of Paris, a very high position, called for an inaugural speech. It is believed that Calvin assisted in the composition of that speech, and this inaugural address included evangelical overtones, and Cope quoted Luther and Erasmus, both of whom were on the forbidden index at the Catholic Church. So Cope was accused of heresy. He was forced to flee, and he went to Basel. Because Calvin was Cope's friend, and because he was suspected of co-authoring the address, well, Calvin was forced to flee as well, and he also went to Basel. Now, we don't know as much about Calvin's personal life as we know of, say, Martin Luther's or Augustine's. Calvin simply did not reveal himself in his writings, a very private person. But from some of his writings, we get the idea that in 1533, whether in Paris just before he fled or later that year while he was in exile, Calvin somehow rejected the Catholic Church and became a convinced Protestant reformer. We do know that it was during this time that he renounced his tonsure and his income from the church. And this is what he said later about this time in his life. He said, "What happened first was that by an unexpected conversion, God tamed to teachableness a mind too stubborn for its years. For I was so strongly devoted to the superstitions of the papacy that nothing less could draw me from such depth of mire." We see in this statement some of Calvin's theology about the sovereignty of God, the irresistibility of grace, and unconditional election. Also, we see the influence of Augustine when Calvin talks about the mire that he was drawn out of. Even though he didn't use the word irresistible, his mind was firmly entrenched in the mire of Catholic teachings, and yet he was drawn irresistibly out of it and set free into an unexpected, unmerited conversion. And so we see how John Calvin's own experience fueled and influenced his later theology about salvation through unconditional election, irresistible grace, and so on. So let's keep moving and see what happens next. All right, in 1536, from Basel, he published the first version, the first of 4 versions of his Institutes of the Christian Religion. This was an elementary textbook for the Christian faith. Its importance and significance cannot be overestimated. If you think about the writings of other reformers such as Luther, Zwingli, even Hubmaier, most of their writings were in response to specific events, questions, conflicts, and so they dealt with an occasion. We call them occasional writings. But at this point in Calvin's life, he has enough leisure time to sit down and systematize the thought of the Reformation. And so this is the first systematic theology of the Reformation. And for this reason, it is quite important in the history of the topic we're looking at. He dedicated this book to Francis I. Even though King Francis had been opposed to the Reformation, Calvin wanted to defend evangelicals who were being persecuted. He hoped that by making this dedication that Francis would soften his stance against the reformers. Not so, but it was a good hope. The Apostles' Creed provided the outline, and the first edition was small enough to fit in the large coat pocket that was fashionable in overcoats that day. How ironic that his 4th edition would end up in as two very large books in my library. Okay, so he expanded it over the years, as we will see. The opening sentence, our true and genuine wisdom can be summed up as the knowledge of God and the knowledge of ourselves. And so God and humanity will be the subjects of the institutes of the Christian religion. All right, now let us talk about Geneva, which is the site where Calvin will spend most of his life and most of his ministry. Geneva, Switzerland, is like Zurich, a canton and an independent canton within the Confederation of Switzerland. In 1527, three cantons, Geneva, Bern, and Freiburg, overthrew the control of the Roman Catholic bishop and the Catholic Duke of Savoy. And so they found themselves independent of these Roman Catholic powers. Now, Bern was Protestant and Freiburg was Roman Catholic, and they struggled for controlling influence over Geneva. Would Geneva remain Catholic? Would it go Protestant? Well, in 1535, the city council conducted a disputation in Geneva, and they decided in favor of the Reformation. The next year, the Catholic bishop and duke attacked, but the Bern army, the Protestant army, came to Geneva's defense. And therefore, in May 21st, 1536, Genevan citizens affirmed the Reformation. However, we should not think of the Genevan citizens as devoutly religious or devotedly committed to the Reformation ideals. No, for the most part, they simply wanted to overthrow the control of the Catholic Church and the Catholic Duke. Many of them just want to live their lives as they please, regardless of any kind of religious restrictions. And so we're going to find, pardon me, we're going to find a conflict between many citizens in Geneva and any reforming impulses. All right, so that's where we are in May 21st, 1536. Now, enter John Calvin. John Calvin returned from Basel to Paris and then left directly for Strasbourg. His goal was to find a shade tree. He wanted to sit under it, think deep thoughts, and write books. Well, it's the scholar's dream, isn't it? But he instead, on his way to Strasbourg, had to detour because there's war between Francis I, Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. By the way, Charles V is also Charles I, King of Spain, the one who had attacked and imprisoned Francis earlier. So old enmities between these two. Well, war is going on, and so Calvin has to take a detour, and so he goes to Geneva, intending to spend only one night. But Guillaume Farel, remember him? Brisonnet, the Bishop of Meaux's friend, the reformer who moved to Neuchâtel and probably instigated these placards that brought about persecution. Farel is in Geneva. Farel is the guiding reformer leading Geneva into a more religious, spiritual reform. And so Farel hears that Calvin, the author of the Institutes of Christian Religion, he's there. And so he seeks him out and he urges him to stay. He says, if you refuse to devote yourself with us in the work, God will condemn you. All right, so he calls out all of his forces of persuasion and even threatens Calvin in the process. John Calvin had this to say about Farel later on. He said, Farel, who burned with extraordinary zeal to advance the gospel, immediately strained every nerve to detain me. And after having learned that my heart was set upon devoting myself to private studies, for which I wished to keep myself free from other pursuits, and finding that he gained nothing by his entreaties, he proceeded to utter an imprecation that God would curse my retirement and the tranquility of the studies which I sought, if I should withdraw and refuse to give assistance when the necessity was so urgent. By this imprecation, I was so stricken with terror that I desisted from the journey which I had undertaken. All right, so Farel used his powerful persuasions, powerful work of persuasion and threats to convince Calvin to stay in Geneva and aid in the Reformation. Here's an illustration of Farel with his arm raised, one arm reaching out to grasp Calvin, the other arm pointing to God and calling down God's curse upon Calvin. Well, Calvin was very susceptible to that sort of persuasion. So, while in Geneva, Calvin organized the church with an emphasis on church discipline. Now remember, this group of Genevans who was not particularly religious, they were not keen on church discipline because Calvin would discipline the church in such a way that if he felt a person did not live in a Christ-like manner, Calvin would withhold the Lord's Supper from that person. That is, after all, the first act of church discipline. Well, these Genevans, I call them the libertines because they were seeking to live in moral liberty. They reacted and they decided that they wanted to elect councilmen who would get rid of these preachers. Remember, in a community where the council governs the church, the councilmen actually are the employers of the churchmen. And so because of popular discontent with the rigidity of the reformers, Calvin and Farel, they were able to get enough political support to fire Calvin and Farel and banish them from Geneva. So only 2 years later, the two reformers left Geneva. Farel went back to Neuchâtel, and Calvin finally got to Strasbourg, which is where he wanted to go in the first place. So when he finally made it to Strasbourg in 1538, he encountered Martin Bucer. Remember, Martin Bucer was an Augustinian monk, and he was present at the Heidelberg Disputation when Martin Luther presented his theology of the cross in opposition to the theology of glory. Martin Bucer was convinced by Luther's arguments, and he left the Augustinian order, came to Strasbourg, and there established a Reformation. Okay, now, because Strasbourg was open to reform, French Protestants fled to Strasbourg to find refuge. There were 500 French refugees, and they needed a pastor. So, whom do you think Bucer turned to pastor this rather large congregation? Well, of course, he turned to John Calvin. But John Calvin is still looking for that shade tree. He's still wanting to live a life of leisure and study, and so he refuses to take on this church. Well, Martin Bucer took a page from Farel's Manual of Persuasion, and he threatened Calvin that if he does not pastor in Strasbourg, that he's going to be like Jonah, and the Lord is going to toss him into a place of danger. And so, there we go. He's convinced. He certainly is susceptible to threats, and he remains in Strasbourg. Now, Strasbourg is an important time for John Calvin. It is in Strasbourg that he finds himself a wife. All right. When he hit the age of 30, all right, he decided it was time to get married. He looked around, and many of his reforming friends were married. Martin Bucer himself and his wife Elizabeth had a home known as the Inn of Righteousness, where all were welcome. Bucer was so pleased with marriage that he urged marriage for all his ministerial colleagues. And he said, "You ought to have a wife, Calvin." Well, Calvin also was familiar with Philip Melanchthon, Luther's successor in Germany. Melanchthon had been married for 19 years by this time, and his marriage was a very happy one. Mrs. Melanchthon had a rollicking sense of humor, took very good care of Philip. Philip told Calvin, "She always thinks that I am dying of hunger unless I'm stuffed like a sausage." Well, Calvin thought, this is a great idea, to have a woman who'll cook for me. So Calvin realized he needed someone to take care of him. And so he told his associates that he was now in the market for a wife, and he was open to any suggestions. But here are the job qualifications. Always keep in mind what I seek to find in her, for I am none of those insane lovers who embrace also the vices of those with whom they fall in love, where they are smitten at first sight with a fine figure. This only is the beauty that allures me, if she is chaste, if not too fussy or fastidious, if economical, if patient, if there is hope that she will be interested about my health. Okay, so again, want someone to take care of him. And so, during the year 1539, he reserved a date a little after Easter, told his friend William Farel to keep that date open because he wanted him to officiate at the wedding. The problem was there was no bride. The first candidate was brought forward. She was a wealthy German woman, and pardon me, her brother was a strong supporter of Calvin and argued that such a marriage would be beneficial because Calvin could live the life of a scholar on the wealth of his wife. But the problem was that this woman didn't know French. She didn't seem eager to learn French. And so that marriage didn't work out. Now, Farel had a candidate to suggest. She spoke French. She was a devout Protestant, but she was about 15 years older than Calvin, and so Calvin never followed up on that one. Well, so by the time he hit 31, he began to get discouraged, and he said, "I've not found a wife. I frequently hesitate as to whether I ought any more to seek one." Well, sometimes when you don't seek, you find. There was a family that had come to Strasbourg, actually an Anabaptist family, but Calvin had converted them away from the ideas of believers' baptism. Boo. And so they became allies and friends of Calvin. The husband passed away. And after a suitable time, Bucer suggested that Calvin cast his eye on the widow. She's attractive, intelligent, a woman with culture, and a woman of character and quiet strength. And so, indeed, Calvin married Idelette de Bure. She brought a son and a daughter to the marriage. She bore 3 children to Calvin, but none of them survived. And so Calvin raised her son and daughter as his own. Evidently, the marriage was happy, but lasted only 9 years until Idolette's death. And so, very important event took place in Calvin's life in Strasbourg. Now, Calvin did undertake writing projects in Strasbourg while pastoring the church. He composed a second edition of the Institutes in Latin and then translated it into French. And this became his pattern to publish a Latin edition and then a French edition of the Institutes. And then he wrote one of his most masterful works in the form of a letter, the reply to Sadoleto. The Roman Catholic Church did not just sit on its hands and watch these reformed territories drift away from the Catholic fold. No, they began reaching out and attempting to persuade them back to the Catholic Church. And so when Cardinal Sadoleto saw Calvin and Farel, the reformers, leave Geneva, he thought this might be a good time to try to persuade Geneva to return to Catholicism. And so he wrote a letter to the Geneva City Council, attempting to persuade them to become Catholic again. There was no one in Geneva capable of responding to Sadoleto's arguments, and so they reached out to Calvin, asking him to compose the reply. He replied in 6 days with devastating eloquence. Calvin effectively countered Sadoleto's argument. It was a religious and literary masterpiece. Calvin skillfully defended the evangelicals against charges of heresy and schism. Calvin even turned the tables and challenged Cardinal Sadoleto himself to return to the true faith of the Church Fathers. As he made clear, Calvin did not believe that he or the other Protestant leaders were the innovators in religion. Indeed, the reason that the religious movement of the 16th century was called the Reformation rather than the Revolution was because Protestants were seeking to re-establish and reform the true church, which had declined under the ever-increasing political aspirations of the Renaissance popes. And so what a clear statement that he made against Cardinal Sadoleto. You are the one who needs reformation. We are the true church. You are the false church. So it's masterfully done and quite effective. And as a result, Geneva asked Calvin to return. He said that he would rather die on 100 crosses than return to Geneva, but nonetheless, he did so in 1541. He walked into his church, St. Pierre's church, and climbed to the pulpit. He opened up his Bible to the very text that he was set to preach back in 1538, and picked up where he left off without any reference at all to his absence. Well, he set to work immediately on organizing the church. In 1541, he produced his ecclesiastical ordinances, where he established the fourfold ministry of the church. The fourfold ministry consists of pastors, doctors, those whom we would call teachers, elders, and deacons. Now, in most Baptist churches, we have pastors and deacons. In some Baptist churches, we are adding into the ministry elders, but even so, the elders of contemporary Baptist churches do not function at all in the same way that elders did in Calvin's church. So let's look at the fourfold ministry of Calvin's church. First, to the pastors was committed the ministry of the word and the sacraments. And so this is the leading pastor, what we might call the senior pastor. But there were the teaching pastors, those who had the responsibility for the education of both adults and children. And so they held lectures on the Old and New Testaments on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. The third order was that of the elders, all right? And the elders were the lay people who lived in the different quarters of the city. In each district, there would be one or two elders, and their responsibility was to keep an eye on spiritual affairs. For example, if they saw that so-and-so was frequently the worse for drink, they'd take note of that. Or if Mr. X beat up his wife, or if Mr. Y and Mrs. Z were seeing rather a lot of each other, then they were to admonish them in a brotherly fashion to desist in their errors and straighten up their lifestyles. If these did not respond satisfactorily, then the elders would report the matter to the consistory. The consistory was a committee of both pastors and lay people who are responsible for the moral conduct of the city. The consistory then would summon the offender or offenders and remonstrate with him or her. And if this failed, as a last resort, they would pronounce excommunication, which would remain in force until the offenders repented. All right, so the elders were used sort of to spy out on their neighbors in the different districts of Geneva. Finally, the deacons were in charge of the social welfare work. They managed the hospitals, social security, almshouses, and so on. And so that was the practice of the deacons in the Geneva church. So the consistory was formed to handle discipline, and this was a church-state organization that consisted of both pastors and lay people. These lay people were taken from the city councils, and they were utilized to stifle any opposition, any heresy, or any perceived immorality. Anyone who opposed Calvin was dealt with severely, either deposed from a position or even banished. There was a problem that developed with a man named Jerome Bolsec, who in 1550 arrived as a refugee. He was a former Carmelite monk. He'd left the Roman Church to become a Protestant. He took up the medical profession, but he still was interested in theology. He began to question and then to denounce Calvin's doctrine of predestination, that aspect of predestination where Calvin said that God condemned some to damnation. he said that this doctrine made God a patron of criminals and worse than Satan. So he was admonished by the church authorities. He was told to cease from such activities. Calvin met privately with Bolsec in an effort to resolve the differences, but Bolsec remained unconvinced and still made his public attacks against Calvin's doctrine. During a church meeting in 1551, he erupted in a vigorous renunciation of this doctrine as well as the Genevan clergy. At that time, Calvin entered the church, and Bolsec began to turn his attack toward Calvin. Well, not all in Geneva agreed with Calvin's view of predestination, and so the city council decided to consult with other Swiss churches. Now, the churches generally sided with Calvin, but they were not fully supportive of Calvin's doctrine of the predestination of the damned. And so the result was a milder judgment on Bolsec. But ultimately, the consistory banished Bolsec from Geneva because of his disagreements with Calvin, and ultimately he returned to the Roman Church. Now, the Libertine Party, this was this group of Genevans who had supported the Reformation only to get out from under the Catholic domination. The Libertine Party continued to exist. These were the ones who had managed to force Calvin and Farel out back in 1538. They still were opposed to Calvin's Puritanistic reforms. And then Michael Servetus entered Geneva and had a major impact on Calvin's reputation, his ministry, and the turn of events in Geneva. This is such an important event and topic in the history of John Calvin and Geneva that we're going to pause here. We'll come back and pick it up with Michael Servetus in our next lecture. Thank you for your attention so far. I hope that you're learning a lot about John Calvin, adored and abhorred.